Коллеги, добрый день. Очень рада видеть вас здесь у нас в Банке России. Приветствую наших онлайн-участников. И начинаем нашу пресс-конференцию. В пресс-конференции принимает участие председатель Банка России Эльвира Набиуллина и заместитель председателя Алексей Заботкин. И вначале традиционные...
So now we will hear the statement by the Governor following the Board of Directors meeting. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Good afternoon. Today we have made a decision to keep the key rate at 7.5% per annum. Domestic demand continues to increase, driven by both consumer activity and the public sector. Retail lending has notably expanded in recent months. Coupled with a rise in household incomes, this growth is boosting the active recovery of consumer demand. Accordingly, current price growth has been accelerating more and more owing to stable rather than one-off factors. Further on, the increase in demand will be limited by supply-side constraints, first of all, staff shortages across a broad range of industries. When companies' capacities to ramp up output are limited, higher demand will translate into a rise in prices. Pro-inflationary risks have grown since our April meeting, which means that a key rate increase has also become more likely. We hold open the prospect that the key rate might be raised at the next meetings. The extent of the increase will depend on incoming data on changes in prices, inflation expectations, and aggregate demand, as well as on how significantly these data will affect the risks of an inflation deviation from the target of close to 4% in 2024. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our decision. Firstly, as regards inflation. The dynamics of annual inflation reversed, and, according to our assessments, it started to accelerate in May after the 12 months of its reduction. Comprehensive data on inflation in May are to be released tonight. Current price growth continues to speed up and is now already close to 4% in annualized terms. It is noteworthy that these are the stable components of inflation that are increasing, whereas the contribution of volatile components is declining. The key factor is consumer demand. According to recent data, consumer activity in the second quarter exceeds our expectations. It is driven by the actual and expected rise in wages amid staff shortages in the labor market, on the one hand, and by the considerable expansion of lending, including unsecured consumer lending, on the other hand. Households' propensity to save is going down gradually. Inflation expectations generally stay elevated. In May, households' expectations edged up slightly after the 2 months of their decline. Business price expectations have been changing diversely across industries. They remain decreased in agriculture, apparently because of the remaining large stocks of the previous year's harvest, while trade companies, to the contrary, have been increasing their price expectations. Manufacturing, transport, and storage enterprises have also raised their price expectations as their estimates of expected demand have improved. Secondly, the economy continues to recover to its pre-crisis levels. According to the April statistics, business activity has grown across many key industries of the economy, namely manufacturing, construction, retail, as well as services and public catering. The Business Climate Index, calculated by the Bank of Russia, based on the monitoring of companies, stays close to its 10-year highs, although it adjusted downwards in May. As estimated by our regional branches, domestic tourism is becoming one of the new growth drivers in the changing conditions. Many regions have recorded an expansion in machine building. Siberia has built up output of non-ferrous metals and chemicals. Central Russia and the Urals have increased output of ferrous metals. The domestic tourism and metallurgy topics are covered in the boxes of our Regional Economy May report. Some other industries also report a rebound in output to the levels of late 2021. Overall, economic trends have been improving owing to the components of domestic demand that have fully recovered and continue to grow, substituting the share of exports in the structure of the economy. This is the key structural change. Considering the gradual substitution of external demand for domestic demand, we forecast that the economy will bounce back to its pre-crisis level next year. We take into account the current structural changes when making our monetary policy decisions. First of all, this expansion of domestic demand amid supply-side constraints is inherently causing a rise in inflationary pressure. Secondly, this involves an additional increase in the labor market tightness. The production of export commodities is less labor-intensive and requires a lower number of workers than that needed to manufacture goods and services for growing domestic consumption. Import substitution involves the establishment of new enterprises inside the country, which requires a larger number of workers. According to our monitoring of businesses, pressure in the labor market has been growing. In May, companies' estimates of the sufficiency of workforce continued to worsen. The staff deficit is most acute in machine building, metallurgy, and mining and quarrying. Such a situation in the labor market is a considerable constraint for a further expansion of output. Moreover, increasingly more companies are reporting problems with imports due to secondary sanctions. Thirdly, monetary conditions have eased, although remain neutral overall. The yield curve of federal government bonds has changed only slightly from the April meeting of the Board of Directors. The expansion of lending, especially in the retail segment, continues to speed up, supported by non-price lending conditions that have eased somewhat. Banks expect an increase in companies' revenues and households' incomes and, therefore, are ready to issue loans to a wider range of borrowers in larger amounts. To prevent an accumulation of the risks of lending to over-indebted borrowers, from 1st July, we will reduce the maximum allowable proportion of such loans in overall lending for banks and microfinance organizations. The trends forming in the retail lending market might suggest a gradual shift towards an increase in the propensity to consume, as a result of which the saving ratio is going down from its elevated levels. Yields on corporate bonds have edged down slightly as well. The value of initial offerings was high in April-May this year. Now, I would like to speak of external conditions. The global banking sector has apparently managed to overcome the acute stage of the crisis. However, risks for the world economy remain. After the active post-coronavirus recovery in the first quarter, the Chinese economy has slowed down. The growth rates in major economies are expected to be more moderate in the future. This is affecting prices for commodities, a large exporter of which is our country. Recently, we have been observing a reduction in global prices for gas, coal, metals and fertilizers. In addition, the world economy is returning to its pre-pandemic structure. During the pandemic, the demand for services plummeted while the demand for goods was up. Now the situation has reversed. High-frequency indicators show a steady increase in economic activity worldwide, driven by services, whereas the expansion in the industrial sector is slower. For Russia, all these trends will involve a further contraction in the surplus of the balance of trade. All else being equal, this reduction might have a pro-inflationary effect through the exchange rate. Moreover, the geopolitical tensions also have a strong negative impact. Trade partners are becoming more concerned about the secondary sanctions, which might make settlements even more complicated and additionally increase delivery periods. I will now speak of the risks that might cause a deviation of inflation from the baseline forecast. According to our estimate, the balance of risks has shifted towards pro-inflationary ones even more. Staff shortages might become the key supply-side constraint, due to which the capacities to ramp up output might be insufficient to meet expanding demand. This might accelerate price growth above the inflation target of close to 4%. Besides, the risk of a further tightening of the sanctions, especially secondary ones, are growing. There are still risks of a slowdown in the world economy. As to disinflationary risks, it is possible to speak of households' high propensity to save and the effect of the previous year's record harvest. We will continue to closely monitor the progress of the implementation of fiscal policy, since fiscal and monetary policies both impact aggregate demand. They cannot be accommodative simultaneously after inflation returns to its target rate. When the fiscal stimulus increases, the central bank needs to symmetrically reduce the impulse through the credit channel in order to maintain price stability. This might require an additional rise in the key rate. Winding up, I would like to comment on monetary policy prospects. We reaffirm our determination to bring inflation back to the target next year and maintain it at the target level further on. Considering the intensifying inflationary pressure, we admit the possibility that we might need to raise the key rate already at the next meetings in order to limit inflation. The percentage of a key rate increase will depend on how significantly incoming data will affect our estimate of the balance of risks to the achievement of the 4% target in 2024. Thank you for your attention. Well, dear colleagues, now over to the Q&A. Please introduce yourselves, identify your agency. Anastasia in the first row, please. Anastasia Savelova from Interfax. In the press release, you are noting the risks of the consumer demand growth, which may run ahead of the capacity to grow output. Do I understand correctly that you are warning of the risks that the Russian economy may enter into the overheating period, how material it is and how strongly it may impact inflation, do you think? Do you believe that expanding imports may alleviate this disbalance? And what are other trends that may play this risk down? And my second question, in April, you mentioned the difficulties related to the repatriation of export revenue in the national currency, specifically in rupees. The central bank is getting information from exporters. Could you tell us about the extent that this problem is large-scale in rupees and basically in the national currencies as far as exporters are concerned? Regarding the overheating risks, it is when the GDP is above its potential. In the case when the demand is growing faster than the supply. I mean, that is when the GDP is at its potential. An indicator of such an overheating is inflation, when inflation becomes higher than the target level. Currently, we do not observe. I mean, we cannot say that the economy is overheating, but the risks of such a mode of it are there, so we need to be mindful of that, and that is why we are talking about the pro-inflationary risks and factors. With regard to expanding imports, part of the domestic demand, the growing one, which is not covered, which is not met by the domestic supply, can be met with imports. That creates a certain flexibility, but in order for the import to do that, the import ought to grow along with the exports. I mean, the exports have to grow. So here you need to watch out over the way the trade balance is evolving. Alexei Borisovich, would you add something? Yes, just a slight additional comment. When import is growing and export is not able to pick up, then you would be in an exchange rate decline, and inflation consequently will grow. Now, if exports is at par with imports, through the exchange channel of the currency pressure, the balance will be maintained. But in order to maintain exports and grow it, you need to have resources domestically, like the labor resources and materials. In order to grow exports, your economics will be growing above its potential, and the inflation will manifest itself through this channel. So import cannot resolve the problem of overheating in full, only if the economy goes back to the trajectory of a stable and well-balanced development, and the potential growth in terms of its development rate. As far as settlements in national currencies are concerned and the way that affects markets, well, definitely, and it is quite evident that there is a shift into making settlements in national currencies, including in rubles. Looking at the April data, already 41% of our exports is paid for in rubles. The currency revenue in other currencies, not only in other currencies, it is less even in terms of its inflow compared to what it used before, because there's a problem of settlements, yes. But overall, we do acknowledge that the volumes of the FX revenues sales remain high. For example, January to April data shows that our biggest exporters are selling 78% of their FX revenue. I mean, that is quite a high indicator. Of course, there do exist problems with being paid and making settlements in national currencies of other countries, which depends upon several factors. Upon two ones. In the first place, we have disbalances in trade, because if there aren't any balances and the exports and imports in a smooth way flow in and flow out in terms of this national currencies, no such problems surface. But regrettably, we have some disbalances by many countries, so there is an issue of asset accumulation, value denominated in a specific national currency and its use. So it's either converting it to other currencies or putting them into certain assets. And so the question that comes up here is the extent to which it is quite easy to use this national currency, because there are certain restrictions in some countries, and so owing assets in national currencies depends upon the will and intention of individual businesses. Not everybody wants to do that, so different options are being considered. That's what our exporters do and our businesses do, including using third country currencies in the settlement arrangement, the ones that might be interested in that. As far as the rupee settlement issue is concerned, there's a bit of an issue, but one cannot describe it as large-scale. Yes, it is there, but we do not see it as having a potential to exacerbate itself. Colleagues, please. Rita, in the first row. Rita Shpilevskaya, TASS agency. My traditional question, have you considered the option of raising the key rate today? And have you discussed the neutral key range, like Mr. Zabotkin previously mentioned? Yes, we have materially considered the option of raising the key rate, but we arrived at a consensus, which was the decision to keep it as it was, but to toughen our signal. So the probability of the key rate becoming higher is stronger. As far as the neutral key rate range is concerned, yes, we do confirm that we are going to review our assessment of the neutral key rate range, but that will take place within the main monetary policy guidelines, which is going to take place in autumn, in summer and autumn, but it will be updated towards us raising our expectations of the neutral key rate range. Thank you. The next question comes from Angelika Naumova, Yushkorola Weekly. Good afternoon. In 2024, inflation is expected to come back to its target level. Does it mean that in 2024, the Bank of Russia will revert back to the possibility of lowering its target inflation target, to what extent the potential to reduce inflation has been exhausted, which is something that we remember being the base by the end of 2021. Does the Bank of Russia plan to revisit this issue in 2023? If not, it happens that the Bank of Russia doesn't expect that the Russian economy will recover up to the level of 2021. Well, thank you. Let me begin with your last point. We expect the Russian economy to recover to the level of 2021 in 2024. However, the question of whether the inflation target needs to be changed does not depend upon when the economy is going to come back to the level it had before it declined in 2021. As part of our monetary policy review, which is currently underway, discussing this issue, whether it's worthwhile reducing the inflation target, this discussion is not over yet. And I would like to say that our research shows that reducing the inflation target may have a positive impact upon the growth of economic values. But to our mind, that in terms of possible timing within which we need to achieve it requires us to take into account the structural changes taking place in the economy. Because in any case, changing the inflation target, we feel, must occur after we make inflation stable close to the current 4% level. And the decisions that we're making based on the understanding that the current inflation target level is 4%. Next, Dmitry. Dmitry Butenko, Kommersant. Now, whereas in the past communications after the previous board of directors meetings continuously we hear the term that the savings are at an elevated level, although quite obviously they could be at a lower level, could you please describe the neutral level of savings against which you are measuring yourselves and the factors which impact it? Because one of them you described last time, I mean, amongst the indicators, which is the amount of current accounts or accounts deposited to maturity. So how else do you measure it? Thank you very much. It's a very appropriate question because we also discuss it when we are talking about lowering the savings standards, at which level such a standard of savings may remain. We believe that under the current environment it can historically be higher. I mean, it can be higher than the historical savings standard used to be before 2022, simply because the households, against the overall uncertainty, may wish to have a stronger safety cushion. So that is what we are monitoring in terms of indicators. And as far as other indicators are concerned, indeed, there are different ones, not only the liquid part of savings and illiquid one, the overall saving standards. We do such estimates. Maybe Mr. Zapotkin will say a few more words about it. Yes, it's a very important issue. Bearing in mind the fact that in 2021, 2022, the savings standard was fluctuating quite strongly because of the pandemic, I would suppose that an historic reference level to us is the period of 2018 to 2019, when inflation was close to 4% and the monetary policy was close to the neutral one. And speaking about the indicators, I suppose what we see as important two dimensions. The first one, which shows the share of the current income is saved. Certainly, just doing deposits is not enough, because people do save them in the form of the deposits in the banks, or buying securities, or investing into real estate. So you have got to look at the broadest possible indicator and adjust it by the loans that people take in order to see the net savings. But in order to assess the general picture and the point at which the level of saving is now, there's another important indicator that we follow, which is the savings additional savings as opposed to the level of income, because in the past year, it went down because of the growing inflation, because inflation, it's the inflation, and because some of the securities were put on hold or frozen. And so at the current point in time, based on our assessment, through an elevated level of savings over the past 3 to 4 quarters, we effectively have come near the level of savings which has this component in it, which is an extra sort of safety. And so this process is currently over, and that might start to push the level of savings downwards. Thank you. Next, Alexander Pyrozhkov, the Business St. Petersburg publication. Recently, in the debt market, the share of the so-called safety bonds have grown, the floaters and linkers. Also, the share of corporate loans is growing against the floating rates. Is it correct to understand that this particular circumstance strengthened the sensitivity of the corporate sector and the financial industry to a changing key rate? What is the way that the Bank of Russia takes this into account in its monetary decision-making? Yes, indeed, a broader incidence of lending instruments with a floating rate for corporate sector in the first place means an acceleration of the key rate changes impacting the cost of lending to businesses. So transmissionary mechanism is playing itself up faster. Against all things being equal, it means that a bigger share of floating rates, against a larger share of floating rates in the corporate sector, the Bank of Russia may require a less durable period within which the key rate deviates from the neutral level for the purposes of bringing the inflation back to the target. This period may become shorter. Otherwise, we believe that these could be the second-tier effects. More important ones is the fluctuation of the aggregate demand. That is where the GDP currently is, as opposed to the potential GDP. So, nevertheless, such effects may manifest themselves. But I would like to note that the floating rate lending for corporate sectors has the reverse side, which means that businesses take on more of a interest risks, which may reduce the predictability of cash flow. So businesses on their own must do a serious job in terms of assessing, what they're after and how well they are managing their financial risks. Next one, please. Thank you. Dilaris Lutzfeld from RIA Novosti. Elvira Nabiullina, today you have already mentioned several times that the central bank most probably is going to review and raise the key rate at its upcoming board of directors meeting. What is the probability that you might need to do that in July? Does the central bank expect the annual deflation this year in summer? And based on your estimate, the local annual inflation max, being above the target of 4%, will it happen this year or in 2024? If this year, in which quarter, in which month? Thank you. As far as the probability of a higher key rate is concerned, yes, we sent a signal that we do not rule out that the key rate may be raised at one of the upcoming meetings, including the July one, but it will all depend upon the incoming data. With regards to your second question about deflation, this year, no, we don't expect that there will be an annual deflation, but the probability of it, the probability of an annual deflation this year equals 0 in any month. And simply, as we have noted, and as you can see in the annual inflation statistics, in May it has started peaking up. So the last One that we saw was 2.6, and definitely because certain very negative last year's levels are going to be passed through, then the inflation will definitely be rising in autumn. So it is inappropriate to talk about the negative values of it. Yes, as far as the local maximum level of the annual inflation, we expect that it may happen sometime towards the end of this year, in the first half of next year. It is impossible to give you a precise date. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. I will have several questions. Today it was made known that the Association of the Russian Banks forwarded a proposition to the central bank to grant grace period for, in terms of the loans for those who suffered from the terrorist activities and similar kind of things. Could you please tell us what is central bank's position towards it? Because we know that the central bank forwarded a letter to the banks and issued certain guidelines. What kind of guidelines you have given them? My second question also related to the recent news. It has become known that one of the banks has established a very substantial fee for crediting dollar funds to the accounts. So what is the Banks of Russia position towards that? Do you believe that regulation needs to be in place if certain exorbitant fees are being introduced? And my third question, you noted that currently the share of exports that is being paid for in rubles is 41%. Could you tell us specifically what is the share of imports that rubles are being paid for, or in friendly nation currencies? Thank you. As far as your first question is concerned about the lending grace period, our credit policy is such that in such cases, yes, indeed, grace period could be granted. So we came out with a proposition that households, irrespective of their situation, could have an opportunity to enjoy a single case of the repayment grace period due to certain life circumstances. We also understand that the borrowers who had to leave the border territories and should have an opportunity to get in touch with their lenders, the banks and the microfinance organizations, with a request to change the terms and conditions of the lending contract, and the banks should review such applications individually. Yes, we have forwarded our guidelines on that, and I must say that if the bank refuses to do that, we ask household to get in touch with the central bank. We will be monitoring all such requests and queries. One should say that previously we've already been giving to the banks such guidelines to restructure, to refinance the indebtedness of the households which are in dire circumstances. And I must say that the banks responded very constructively in terms of what they were trying to do. And as far as the fees are concerned that the banks are establishing, and as far as the foreign currency transfers are concerned, that is their right to do so. We mentioned it previously. You know, the banks do understand the risks related to working with foreign liquidity. Some of the banks are under restrictions. So in order to reduce such risks and in some extreme situations to avoid households' currencies being frozen, they establish such fees. Now, in as far as the share of settlements denominated in rubles for imports, yes, this process is happening. I don't have the precise data as far as imports are concerned. Yes, the share of settlements in rubles and national currencies is also growing. However, to the extent I remember, it is a little bit slower growing than in relationship to exports. Thank you. Next question comes from Denis Yalachovsky. Complex interest project. Thank you very much. I will have two questions. One is about the exchange rule, and the second one about the balance between the observed and the expected inflation. My first question is, when do you expect the Ministry of Finance will shift its sales of RMB and gold to purchasing? Can the current weakening of the ruble may speed up this process, and what is the way, will there be any additional impact upon inflation in this case and upon the ruble exchange rate once the Ministry of Finance starts selling currency? Will start purchasing currency. And my second question, if one is to take a look at the observed and expected inflation throughout the past 10 years, the observed inflation almost all the time is above the expected one. Essentially, households are always expecting that in about 12 months prices are going to start going slower, and every year they confess that their expectation didn't come true. Does central bank reflect in their forecast that households chronically are underestimating future inflation in their expectation of the rate and consequently in your decisions about the rate? I will start with the second question about the observed and the expected inflation. Currently, we are in a situation where an observed inflation is higher than the expected one, and so the gap between them is bigger than it used to be back in 2018 and 2019. This is happening often after the period of an abrupt price growth increase as a process. And people remember for a long time this spike of inflation, even if it took place a year ago. But the expected inflation is related to the household's trust towards the monetary policy. We certainly are mindful of the observed inflation and the expected one, but in our monetary policy decisions, a much more important value is in the expected inflation. That's why we're saying inflationary expectation based on which people make their decision about saving, about consuming, and so on and so forth. But I actually wouldn't say that households in their expectations always underestimate. More often they overestimate, but actual inflation turns out to be lower. We had such situations as well. As far as buying and purchasing of RMB by Minister of Finance, throughout this year, overall we do not acknowledge the fact that the Ministry of Finance will switch to buying RMBs. In individual months, this may depend upon the incoming revenue and prices, but in terms of the full year, we are not keeping this in mind. Mr. Butkin, could you comment additionally? Yes, this is evident from our macroeconomic forecast. In April, you can see that throughout the full year, the currency reserves are contracting exactly by the value that is going to be reflected in the fiscal rule sales actuals. And there is a common thinking that the Ministry of Finance stance as part of the fiscal rule in a certain way impacts the exchange rate dynamics. This particular view is erroneous because the basic idea behind the fiscal rule is to stabilize spending, but its side effect is that the Ministry of Finance transactions under the fiscal rule very precisely reflect on the fluctuations of the oil and gas revenues. And during the period of time when less currency revenue comes in because of the oil price being low, then the Ministry of Finance compensates for it by selling currency from the National Welfare Fund. When there is more of currency incomes comes in, this excessive value is partially absorbed into the National Welfare Fund. And in terms of the context within which the question was raised, in terms of its impact upon the currency market, the trajectory of the Ministry of Finance activities under the fiscal rule doesn't create an impact. It neutralizes the impact from external factors. Dear colleagues, thank you. Sergey, please. Sergei Bolotov, arguments and facts. In the border regions, the risks have become more acute. with respect to the people's lives and their property. In this sense, does the central bank is discussing with insurance companies changing the terms of the policies in such a way so those who live in the Kursk and Belgorod regions could insure their lives or get coverage paid. And the second question about the product food inflation. Currently in Russia it is at low level, while in the Eastern European countries it's at an unprecedented high level. Is there a risk that this high food inflation from Europe would find its way into the Russian market? Thank you. It is very, very crucial to provide the border region citizens with the possibility to insure their property and lives, bearing in mind the fact that the market players are currently reviewing these insurance risks. We are in a discussion with them to understand what needs to be done in order to provide for such basic financial services being made available to the people out there. So we will act accordingly. And if such market insurance turns out to be too expensive, I mean, the premium risks must add up, well, then there will be necessary government support measures made available, and we will discuss with the government what kind of measures there should be. That is as far as the first question was concerned. Now, with regard to the food inflation, yes, indeed, it is lower. Well, in the first place, because of the base effect. And after the growth it had, remember, in spring last year, the food prices adjusted. Here, the reserved consumer demand played into it, and also the fact that we had a very good crop yield in many ways, as well as a very solid exchange rate being carried forward, which deterred the food price growth. But I must say that the food prices are very volatile. It really depends upon what kind of points you take a look at within 12 months period, because within a year these may fluctuate very strongly. That is why we do acknowledge that there might be a certain increase in the indicators covering it, this whole base effect. But what is important for us is that the overall inflation indicator stays within 4%, because generally that would mean that the food price inflation is moderate. Yes, like in the press release, we noted that the high remaining stocks of the last year's crops and really good expectation for the crop yield this year compared to the annual average, they rather produce disinflationary effects in terms of the remaining period in this year, in as far as the food inflation is concerned. Like Mrs. Nabiullina mentioned, what is important for us is the general inflation level and the rate of growth of the overall prices, and specifically this overall price level being close to 4% and making it stable. That is exactly what the monetary policy is going to try and achieve as its end. Next question from Andrei Pushkarev from Vladivostok newspaper. Recently, central bank is being criticized in terms of what it does towards the key rate, decelerates the economic development. How fair this criticism is? Maybe in the current circumstances, the central bank should resort to a different toolkit rather than just the key rate. No, we're not decelerating. On the contrary, we are facilitating economic growth, well-balanced, solid economic growth, because without being able to solve the price stability as an issue, the economy is going to be edging in between cold and hot. And because quite often what you may end up being, if you're not so cognizant that there could be a price reduction, and then the roller coaster that needs to be put into under control. So macroeconomic policy and the monetary policy are exactly, in terms of the key rate, are called upon to prevent such fluctuations when the economy is one time in the heating mode, another time in the freezing mode. like the previous year's experience demonstrated, our monetary policy approaches targeting the inflation may reduce the consequences not only of the cyclical fluctuations, but even the consequences of some serious structural shocks. While you are suggesting a different toolkit to support the economy is in the government hands, this is about structural change. If you are talking about granting subsidized loans to some industries or to some broad sectors at the expense of the central bank, we believe that that would be rather detrimental to the economy, because for the rest of them who are not going to gain access to subsidized lending, the lending conditions are going to worsen, and that is not going to be too different from offering stimuli to some industries at the expense of others, while the methods of monetary policy and the monetary policy toolset is impacting the whole economy. But apart from the monetary instruments, we as a mega regulator certainly do have other instruments in our hands that we apply to support economic growth, which includes financial market development, stock market development. You know that recently we made a decision about the risk-sensitive banking regulation methods so that the banks could be more keen to fund transformative structural projects, but that is to be defined by the government. The central bank is not the body to pursue structural policy and decide which industries might be assisted and which are not. Yes, Dmitry, second row, please. Thank you. Dmitry, Morocco, Russia 24. Elvira Nabiullina. The technologies related to AI are becoming increasingly popular, the ones like Chat GPT, but many people are warning about the danger involved. So how does the central bank assess the risk related to a possible appearance of such technologies in the financial sector and specifically into the exchange trading? Well, you know, any technology, not only artificial intelligence, opens up new opportunities, but with it comes new risks, and so it is important to be very well aware of such risks. So when technologies like that appear, people are starting to analyze such risks. Not everybody is able to understand what kind of consequences might ensue from it. As far as the AI is concerned, we see that there is a big potential that it may open up, because some of the banks are trying to apply AI solutions in the borrower scoring, in fighting against fraud. Yes, there are opportunities, but you are quite right that one should be very, very mindful of such risks and cut them in the bud so that technologies could bring only good things. Next question comes from online from Evgenia Pismenaya, Bloomberg, please. Good afternoon. I've got one follow-up question. The colleagues raised a question about rupees. Could you be more specific? How much rupees have been accumulated they are not able to convert? Maybe not a precise amount. I understand that could be difficult, but millions of US dollars worth, or billions, or dozens of billions worth. I mean, just to understand the scale of this not very terrible but a growing problem. My second question is that there is information coming into the mass media saying that over the past 12 months you've been able to achieve a much better quality of your interoperability with the government. They currently are putting together joint plans following a certain Chinese methodology to achieve the stable GDP development against the financial stability, as I understand, not targeting inflation. I mean, the inflation is being kept in mind, but the first set of indicators is improving and raising the GDP with this stability. Is that true? Somehow we'll miss this thing out. Well, as far as the accumulated rupee revenue is concerned, I'm not going to quote the figure, but I would like to say that the scale is insignificant if you measure it as a share in the overall currency revenue. With respect to our interoperability with the government, no changes are taking place in the format of our cooperation with respect to the macroeconomic policy. and it is not expected. When I was saying, and I also spoke about the higher level of coordination in between us and the government, in the first place, I meant about temporary anti-crisis measures, regulatory easing for financial sector, support for borrowers, then certain limitations imposed upon the capital flow. Yes, these are the topics that we discussed with the government in detail. With respect to the macroeconomic policy, this interaction has become also very, very close because against a very high uncertainty, when situation is changing very quickly, we are clocking each other more often in terms of understanding how we are to be on the same page and understand what the future entails. But all decisions about the monetary policy have been made and continue to be made absolutely independently. And as far as our target is concerned to support the economic growth, even now, in a legislative way, it has been defined that the monetary policy target to maintain price stability, amongst other things, to develop a well-balanced and stable economic growth, because price stability is the factor of economic growth, and that is what we understand very well. And in our mind, the independence of the central bank undoubtedly is the most important prerequisite, the most important factor which defines macroeconomic stability, and in the end of the day, long-term stable growth and long-term the well-being of the country's citizens. As far, yes, yes, that's it. Yeah. I mean, the second question was the first one. Dear colleagues, your questions, Marina, please. Good afternoon, Marina, Business News and TV. Recently, Ministry of Industry and Trade disclosed its plans to reduce parallel import because of the emergence of Russian analogs, while previously it said that the parallel import helps prices to go down. Doesn't the central bank see the risks that the inflation may speed up if the parallel import is cut? And my second question about the digital ruble. Currently, there are cashless settlements, cards, SBP, MIR, all kinds of payment stickers. What is it that we should expect to appear in the digital rubles to make the Russians interested, to provoke them into using it? And do I understand it correctly that the first need that you have for it is cross-border settlements? As far as the parallel import and import substitution is concerned, well, there should be a certain balance of things, I believe, and the government, I gather, shall find such a balance in order to provide for the availability and the affordability of goods which used to be imported previously once they are produced here. In terms of the impact upon the monetary policy, as we used to say, import substitution requires additional labor, but with respect to import, the import has to be paid for. Export also requires workforce to support it, although our traditional export is less labor intensive. And against all things being equal, I would suppose that the reduction of the parallel import and import substitution may somewhat strengthen the labor market tension, but we're going to take into account, and if it attains any large scale, we will certainly decide how to deal with it. I can also say that once new restrictions appear with respect to the import, possibly like what you've said, if the secondary sanctions are stronger and the domestic manufacturers won't be in a position to supply goods at the comparable prices like the ones that are pricing currently the imported products, that would flow out into higher prices for consumers. And your second question about the digital rubles. Yes, indeed, we've always used to say it. Our financial sector is very advanced in terms of the innovative level of services and the comfort as a feature of such services and diversity of such services. So such a notable growth in quality will happen here as opposed to the countries which don't have them once they introduce digital currencies. But I believe that we will have some. First, a weaker dependence upon any specific bank when doing a transfer in terms of individual banks' fees. The second thing, we also mentioned it, in our case, the indicator of the success of the digital ruble is not the amount of digital rubles in circulation, rather than the banks starting to pay to increase interest paid for the current accounts that people are using, because the digital ruble will enable people to do the same kind of transactions much cheaper, if not at the same level. And the transactional costs are going to go down, and the benefits are going to be enjoyed both by customers and consumers. And the third factor, the potential for the cross-border settlements. That is indeed very important. Thank you. The next question comes from Kira Yukhtenko. Invest Future Project, please. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. I will have several of them with your permission. And again, these are the question on behalf of our investors. The first one, there is quite a big problem with the Belarus Republic bonds. Yes, in February the payment took place, but people are not getting money, so it's hard to understand what is going on. Have there been any changes? Have you been able to work on some sort of a mechanism? My second question is about the East. The fact of the matter is that some of the people are willing to close down their investments in securities, but they cannot do so because, for example, they have one share stuck in their investment account. And there is one big broker with which people are not able to close their accounts, which brings about, a certain emotional grievance and mistrust. So my question is, are you familiar with these issues, and can you do something to solve it? And my third question is about lending. Currently, the banks are quite active in offering cash loans against an ultra-low interest, 3 to 4%, which really sounds very attractive. But the problem is that these are the terms that are in place only for the first month or two, and then followed by very high interest. So what is the regulator's attitude towards it? Will such marketing ruses be made subject to regulation? Well, thank you very much for your questions. As far as the Belarusian euro bonds are concerned, the Bank of Russia knows about the situation. And I would like to draw attention to the fact that the euro bonds by Belarusian Republic are foreign securities, and the obligations are to be acted upon according to the foreign law. We cannot be in control of it. We know that the Belarusian side is working on changing the national legislation in order to produce the mechanisms of a payment transfer to the holders and entirely reflect the entitlements and rights of the Russian depositors and depository, and make sure that such payments eventually take place. In as far as the question you raised about the inability to close down the accounts with the brokerages because of certain shares being there. Yes, we are familiar with this problem. It is effectively a technical issue, and I would like to emphasize it doesn't have any relationship to the overall system of individual investment account as an institution. This problem by now has been dealt with and resolved, and the clients should get in touch with their brokers in order to commence transactions through such an account. The next question was about cash lending, when customers are being enticed by low rates and then followed by the high interest rates. Yes, we're concerned by this problem because the low interest rates are being, advertised in big letters that everyone can see and accept, but the way the interest rate is to grow subsequently is in very, very fine print. Yes, we are worried about it, as well as the Russian antitrust authority is concerned. We stated that such terms should be expressly described on the bank's website, and we are monitoring the way the banks are promoting such products. The antitrust authority is ready to impose supervisory measures because they have that authority when they identify a misdemeanor like that. Currently, we're talking about compensating the full value of the loan, which is to regulate what is to be included into the full body of a loan, but also disclosing information in terms of making it fully correct, and transparency in terms of everything that is related to all payments and transactions. A very short comment. That applies not only to the consumer cash loans, but also to the mortgage loan, to car loans as well, because in all such cases there are various ill practices when people are being enticed by very low starting interest rates without people understanding what kind of a debt burden they would eventually have to take. Thank you. Dear colleagues, in the last row, Olga. Good afternoon. I've got two questions. The first one is about fraudsters who in the social network anonymously offer to people to invest and send them their bank card accounts, and people transfer money there. The central bank is doing a lot of work. There's a lot of social media advertising, a lot of information in the internet from the Minister of about the financial culture. But there is a bit of a nuance that money is transferred to the Russian bank cards, and to the extent I know, there used to be some sort of a mechanism, or was being designed, when you can get in touch with the bank and somehow terminate a transfer, put it on hold for some time. How effective this mechanism? Is it in place? Because people realize that they did something very foolish within minutes, and they're not able to revert it. Maybe the law enforcement doesn't have the necessary qualifications or expertise to support citizens whenever they come for help. So the question is, how worth it to go to the police and get help there? And my second question, is there any information about the blocked exchange mutual funds? Because people are worrying that there is no information seeping out. Is there anything being done there? Well, thank you very much. A very correct question about the fraudsters. The cyber fraudsters' activity remains very high. We are taking measures, and the banks follow suit. They develop some very advanced anti-fraud systems. Nevertheless, the damage remains quite high, although the share of successful fraud transactions declines, but it remains our concern because the social engineering methodology is being really used very broadly. One of the means to deal with it could be a draft act, and we expect that the act will go through an accelerated legislative process, which would make the bank obliged to compensate a customer for the full amount of transaction if the bank transferred money, even when asked by the customer to a fraud account, if this fraud account is in the Bank of Russia database. Trust us, we maintain such a database. Of course, that doesn't resolve the whole problem, but in case money is being transferred to an account which is listed in such a database, the one that we're sharing with the bank, then the bank will have to refund the customer in full. Besides, we anticipate to introduce the two-day hold-up period when the bank is not going to transfer money in a transaction that has a certain suspicious element in it, so that people could come to and cancel the transaction. But of course, not least important is the financial literacy. We shouldn't be complacent here. We mustn't limit the efforts that we undertake, because there should be an active hotline that you can call the bank, and no matter who is on the other line, in law enforcement or the central bank, never share your personal data. We are working with the law enforcement very closely. We are discussing all kinds of measures, and of course, in such cases, you should seek help from the law enforcement. As far as the blocked assets, well, here, work is ongoing. We consider different approaches, but without the decision from the foreign regulators, it is practically very difficult to achieve a solution. We don't have any information about such decisions. The next question comes from Irina Titova, the first regional channel from the city of Orel. The Bank of Russia is conducting public consultation in terms of the review of the monetary policy. Has the information that you have received from the region created any impact upon your today's key rate decision, and have you been relying in any way upon the information that was submitted? Not directly upon our today's key rate decision. Let me explain why. Because the review of the monetary policy is quite a large-scale undertaking by the Bank of Russia, which is a very comprehensive, complex analysis of the monetary policy throughout the whole period of targeting the inflation, which practically covers 8 years. And so we are debating the effects of this policy, the challenges that may arise in the future, how one should fine-tune the monetary policy in order to make it most effective. And that is not about our current decision-making, but nevertheless, the consultations, the discussions at the regional level of the monetary policy review, which engages expert businesses, creates an additional information to our benefit with respect to the current status. And Mr. Zapotkin, he travels to attend such regional consultations, and the Monetary Policy Department people, and they use the information they gather from our regional divisions in order to better understand what's going on regionally. And in such discussions, certainly the topic of the labor market situation is something that is raised quite often. Could you also maybe mention a few more items that you have carried out as your takeaways from such discussions? Well, we haven't doing it for the first time, and effectively it is an extremely useful cycle of meetings. We held 4 such over the past 2 weeks. Additional 3 ones shall take place in the second half of June. So the general topics in terms of the current environment, something that most eloquently is being expressed, is about the difficulties to recruit and even retain personnel, which is what we hear from businesses working in very diverse industries. But in as far as the response to the monetary policy review and our understanding of the inflation target overall, that conforms to what was expressed in the consensus report. The prevalent majority of those involved in the discussion are saying that the target close to 4 is very timely, but the space to discuss the possibility of reducing it is really worth a continued debate. Yes, Elena Fabrichna in the last row. Elena Fabrichna, Reuters. I wanted to ask about the decision to raise the key rate that you said you have considered very, very substantively. Did you discuss any specific steps and which ones, if so? And if the key rate is raised, will the economy be able to achieve its pre-crisis development levels in 2024? My last question is about the budget. Previously, the Central Bank always stated that you hope that in the second half of the year, the Minister of Finance will be able to fit itself into the expected and planned performance. Are your expectations the same, or should one expect that in autumn the attitude is going to be changing in favor of more income or the budget deficit? Yes, you're quite right. We heard different proposals from 0.25 from up to 0.75 as a measure of changing the key rate. And so as far as allowing it to rise and achieving the pre-crisis level, yes, Mr. Zabotkin, could you please say, I can only here refer to our forecast following our April Board of Directors meeting. As you know, the forecast range for the key rate, which was demonstrated in the April forecast, it allowed for the possibility for the key rate to grow in some significant value for the remainder of this year. But at the same time, the GDP growth range, which was put into the very same forecast, is positive. Even at the lower threshold of it, the national economy in 2024 fully recovers up to the level of 2021. So, a very quick answer to your question. The key rate raising will provide for the demand going back to the level which conforms to the economic potential, while the economy itself in 2024 reaches the level that it had in 2021, which is part of our April decision-making. As far as the budget is concerned, in the baseline scenario, practically always we take into account the already announced fiscal policy decisions announced by the government. But as you can see, we also note the risk that the inflation may deviate from the baseline forecast. In the case the fiscal policy is to be changed. And so if the fiscal policy is going to be softer than it has been so far declared, that may require an additional key rate raise, apart from what Mr. Zabotkin have just told us. And going back to the first part of your question, that won't change the growth forecast because the additional demand is going to manifest itself through the fiscal channel, and the amount of demand coming from the private sector is supposed to be a little bit lower. All right, the next question comes from Victoria Shergina, the Law and Finance Project. Victoria, please. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask my question. The Central Bank on more than one occasion stated that attracting retail investors into the financial market is one of the priority tasks. So how things are going right now about creating the system of insurance which will protect the investors from the insolvency of brokerages? If there are plans like that, then within which period of time it is going to come true? My second question, if I may, the people are complaining about the high prices for new construction real estate projects which have been provoked by the subsidized mortgage made available to developers. So what's the central bank's take on it, and what does it do in order to improve the availability of housing to the households? And with regard to the system of insurance coverage for long-term savings, we are currently discussing this together with the Minister of Finance. Our proposal is to make the system not the government-sponsored, but by the market-based ones, to be defined by the marketplace. And so we need to ultimately decide when the insurance case is happening, and what should be the circumstances that one should consider as leading to it. That remains an ongoing process. As far as subsidization is concerned, we believe that the housing subsidization mortgage is concerned is very effective in the crisis environment, but it should be a temporary one, because after that the effects that it creates upon the housing price and the availability of housing may turn to be negative. Last year, we noted that a broad application of subsidized programs offered by the developers led to higher prices, and the price gap being there between the primary and the secondary market, up to 30% gap. So we had to act on it by raising the reserves and impairments related to such lending. We believe that gradually, after such a broad subsidized lending program is over, in order to truly stimulate availability of housing, one should develop individualized, customized lending program. And so subsidized custom program for the secondary housing may work. And that is a customized social support. Doesn't matter where does an individual buy a housing, in the secondary or the primary market, if we consider such program not as the one that supports development and construction industry, but supporting individuals who need to improve their housing. That should cover then both primary and secondary offerings. Anna, in the last row, please. I will have one topic that I would ask you to cover, but a few questions in it. You mentioned changing the NPL limits as of July 1st. The Board of Directors made such a decision. And I would like to ask, how generally do you see the impact from the limitation that you took? Sorry, what kind of limits you are talking about? Social? Oh, macroprudential limits, I see. It's just that in the comments to your decision, there was written that the banks are able to really fit themselves in the current limit boundaries, amongst other things, due to the fact that they have increased the issuance of short-term loans, less than 5 years, the 3-year term loans. So I have a few questions with regard to it. Don't you expect that the overdue status is going to increase? Bad borrowers, roughly speaking, they're currently not able to refinance their loans by extending the lending period and reducing the payment. Don't you expect that there's going to be more of an overdue situation? And why did you decide to go for it, although seemingly everybody was able to fit themselves into the currently existing limits? And the contraction or reducing the limits, would it be just a one-off situation, or will it take place several times? Well, these limits are necessary in order to reduce the size of the risk-wrought lending. The fact that the banks were able to fit themselves into the previously established limits, it doesn't mean that we're satisfied with how it works. We believe that overall it should be reduced, and that's what we're after. But we're simply just allowing time for the banks to readjust their business model, so they're able to fit into the previously existing limits. So they would need to fit themselves into the currently existing limits. We will be very watchful over how they will be trying to bypass it, and we will definitely be scrutinizing the lending dynamics. And as I said, the unsecuritized lending is growing at a very high rate, but importantly, it shouldn't be growing at the expense of the shorter component, because we currently don't note it, because the base is growing. But in order for this large-scale overdue payment to be generated, and that will create problems both for the borrowers and the banks, that is why we are applying these macroprudential limits. Yes, we will watch over the situation, and depending upon there being any need, we will make a decision, and if there is a need for it, we'll do it this year. Thank you very much. The next question comes from Anna Gromova. Anna Finance Project. Anna, please. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask my question. I have two. My first one is about the initiative which has come around a long time ago, but so far it hasn't been turned into the law, about self-ban, self-prohibition on lending. Can one ask the central bank to somehow expedite the passing of this law, because without doubt that is very important. This could protect the household and citizens from the fact that somebody else fraudulently will take a loan in their name. So having this self-prohibition was going to be quite appropriate, for real estate transaction when some fraudulent transactions take place when using a fraudulent power of attorney. And my second question is related to the national currency exchange rate. Many times you stated that the ruble exchange rate is a floating one, but if one takes a look over its dynamics through the past 6 months, the ruble exchange rate went down 30%. I mean, there are many factors which may explain as to why it is happening. I mean, the weaker consumer demand and the imports, but at the same time, when you take a look at the figures, a 30% decline in the strength of the national currency is raising concerns. And I've got just a very simple question. If we could give some guidelines to the people in terms of what they should do with their savings, just allocate them in between different instruments, bearing in mind the current environment and the ruble exchange rate, that really would be great to hear from you some advice. Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. As far as self-prohibition is concerned, we're very actively supporting this initiative, and I do believe, in the very same way you do, that we will give people an additional instruments to enable them to protect themselves from the crooks. But currently, this is in the hands of our legislatures, and we're working with the legislation in order to make sure that this very socially important legislation comes through. As far as the floating exchange rate is concerned and our advice to the people, well, yes, our exchange rate is indeed a floating one. It is dependent upon many circumstances, including the foreign economic environment and so on and so forth. And Mr. Zabotkin may give you a detailed narrative about it. But if we are to talk about what people should save their money, and I can only recommend ruble-denominated savings, because the ruble-denominated savings means that the ruble's purchasing power is sustained. I mean, how much goods and services you can buy for your wage. And we are pursuing the price stability policy specifically to support the ruble-denominated wages and the purchasing power, its purchasing power. Mr. Botkin, yeah, maybe just a few more facts about the exchange rate. Like in all kinds of changes, it's really important from which point you mark it and measure, because last year there was a very big fluctuation. If you compare it to the exchange rate last year, we see it as a material decline. But it would be correct to compare it to the beginning of the 2022. And here, the decline against the dollar was about 11%. I mean, since the beginning of January 2022 until now. As opposed to euro, this decline is 5%. To RMB, to yuan, just 3% within the same period of time. So to say that the ruble has seriously weakened as the result of all the events which have happened over the past 18 months doesn't hold any water. Ekaterina, in the last row, your question, please. Yes, good afternoon. Ekaterina Letova, Vedomosti. Mr. Zabotkin, in the middle of May, said that the Bank of Russia would review the possibility of publishing the ruble exchange rate range if it wouldn't see any risk of the market perceiving it in a certain wrong way. So how high is the probability that the central bank will start publishing this statistic? And my second question is again about the blocked assets, because there is a rumor, an idea being stated in the market that the blocked assets, the Clearstream and Eurostreams ones, should be used in Russia to compensate for the losses incurred by the Russian investors. I think Mr. Peskov recently was heard saying words about it. So what does the Russian bank think about it? All right, so publishing the exchange rate range. Well, this discussion is going through a discussion. Yes, we are currently reviewing this option. We are aware that the exchange rate forecast is an important factor for business planning by many businesses, but
it is also very important for us not to be perceived as the commitment on the part of the Bank of Russia to ensure that it is like that. So we want to avoid the situation when a broad range of economic players are going to take it as a target value. No, we don't have a target exchange rate. We have a target inflation. We looked at the experience of other national central banks. Some do publish it, some don't. So we're currently debating it. So in the process of reviewing our monetary policy, we will come to some sort of opinion. As far as the possibility to use the frozen assets, I think the swap of the frozen assets is possible because the assets are frozen. They are not confiscated, because in order to confiscate them, you need to be able to compensate something for that. So there are different options that we're considering to deblock the frozen assets in question. The next question comes from Tatiana Chibasova from Interfox. Tanya, please. Good afternoon. My question is about the mortgage market, which currently is not, as strange as it may sound, very valid, because since the previous board of directors meeting, there appeared several public schemes related to mortgage. First of all, the central bank noted a growing level of lending loans issued for the term of 30 years. So how does regulator intend to monitor this? What kind of regulation you are planning to put in place? Secondly, in the financial stability review, the central bank also noted the one-time contribution term that allows one to get a discount in a mortgage loan. I'm also interested to find out whether the central bank is intending to curtail such schemes. Is it something that the new regulation that the central bank has introduced at the end of May covers this? My other question, that recently you visited Iran. Could you tell us what are the agreements that you have been able to reach? For example, when Iran will start accepting the Mir cards, and will there be any other activities in relationship to the Russian-Iranian mutual settlements, and what the central banks of Iran and Russia are planning to do towards it? Thank you. As far as mortgage lending is concerned, there are new schemes are out there. We are analyzing them, extending the maturity period, and we're trying to understand what kind of risks work out of it. In a number of cases, maybe even with a one-time contribution, efforts should be aimed at properly informing borrowers about the specificities of such a financial product, as long as additional risks may appear for the borrower's future financial viability. We believe that it doesn't create the level of negative risks like in the case of the mortgage solutions from developers. We believe that in a number of cases one can restrict oneself to simply obliging the banks to provide correct, transparent, and authentic information about what they're offering. And so if such scheming we see as gearing up, we will definitely undertake an action and will insist upon certain systemic measures. There was also a question about the settlements and mutual acceptance of different national payment instruments. Well, this work is underway, but usually we do not make any announcements with regard to those details. Lada, over there in the first row, please. Good afternoon, Lada Alimova, Frank Media. My first question, the Belgorod region, which is currently under fire, traditionally
has quite a big share of the farming industry. It has about 15% of all operators, and many businesses like that are also major borrowers. Does the central bank plan to undertake any measures in as far as any losses are concerned with respect to such lending in terms of impairments? And my second question, the market-based additional issue placement by VTB took place, and the pension money was involved in, as far as we know, this kind of practice when the pension funds invest funds into the bank's shares and other financial institutions' shares in the past was quite characteristic of the so-called Moscow pension circle, but in time, seemingly, it became abandoned. What do you think about this coming back again? And what do you think when an issuer refuses to disclose its anchor investor during an IPO? Well, as far as the situation with the agro-industrial complex in Belgrade is concerned, the already existing regulation envisages the kind of a situation where banks don't have to raise their impairment if the financial status of a borrower worsen because of an emergency situation, so they can stay with the level they had for the next 3 years, and consequently they can use the existing norm. If they need more, we will definitely consider it. As far as additional issues are concerned by the banks, we don't comment, and definitely there is no resurgence of the so-called Moscow circle. It's just the placement of stock. After we became a mega regulator and we took under our supervision non-government pension funds, we ended up having a much more effective supervision toolkit, including the stress testing. Of course, we are not insisting that every time a pension fund is buying an asset, it should be cleared, because such assets should be acquired in accordance with the investment prospectus. But there are, of course, investors and there are entities which are looking after there being a well-calculated financial stability. But if an additional placement is taking place according to an open subscription, it means that the emission prospectus doesn't mention potential acquirer, but in terms of the securities, theoretically, if it's an open subscription, then any investor can come in. Thank you. The next question comes from the Simple Economics project online. Over the past 6 months, the Western banking system faced the run on the banks, which led to bankruptcies and banks being bought out by bigger players against some of the banks keeping their assets in a very conservative form in the government securities. Now, with this in mind, is the Bank of Russia planning to adjust the adequacy ratio and other standards for the Russian banks, or is the Russian banking industry not yet at the international level of development? Well, it is true that we are very attentively researching what is happening in the West in order to learn from other people's mistakes. And in the case of the recent banking crisis with the viability of the middle-sized American banks, in the first place, it was the result of the short-term deposits, which under the current technological environment can very easily slip out of the banks. There used to be very long-term investments into very sound government securities, but many banks, after the rates went up and that securities lost their value, they were put into the maturity portfolio. And when this thing started happening, so it came as an avalanche. So, of course, that forces us also to once again consider how the liquidity risks should be regulated. Before the end of this year, inside the Bank of Russia,
we will hold a discussion about what kind of a better liquidity standards we should have, because we actually had planned that before the crisis station together with the American Bank in order to take into account our specificities in the Russian market structure and the liquidity property of different instruments. And so we would gradually introduce that. Our plan is to introduce it in 2024-25. And of course, we're very mindful of the interest risk control, because what happened in the United States, effectively, that was the problem. That was the problem of managing the key rate. The interest rates, the interest risk. And so we would need to change certain things here, but the interest risk is something that is worth paying particular attention to. Mr. Zabukin? Yes, certainly, both the banks and the supervisory agencies, they should watch attentively over the interest risk. But I would like to underscore something that we mentioned during the previous Board of Directors meeting and in the following press conference. I think it was in March. What happened in the United States and in Europe in many ways is related to a very long period of low interest rate period, because everybody have grown used and were overconfident that the rate will remain at zero, very close to it. And once inflation hit and one had to respond with monetary policy measures, the banking system was not capable of coping with it. So this is the consequence of the excessive monetary policy that took place over the previous periods. Dear colleagues, we've been working now for more than an hour and a half. I guess this is the last question. Artyom? Elvira Nabiullina, good afternoon. Teretyev Artyom, Forbes. I've got two questions. My first one is about FATF meeting that is going to take in June. Often we hear now the concerns that Russia may be included into the grey or even the black list. How probable is this scenario? Have you considered it with the financial marketplace, and what kind of consequences there might ensue from it for the Russian banks and investment companies if Russia is put into the grey or black list? And my second question about RMB. Towards the end of May, the bank's representative expressed their concerns that in Russia, the RMB deficit that we experience. Do you believe that this is a temporary phenomenon, considering the temporary needs of some companies, or is it a stable kind of a long-term situation that is conditioned by an overall growth of the Chinese imports into Russia and the need to lend more RMBs to the Russian company? As far as FATF is concerned, first of all, I would like to remind you that in 2019, we used to have a comprehensive assessment of the Russian anti-money laundering system by FATF. We passed it with flying colors, and we received a very high assessment. And so this anti-money laundering system continues to operate. Objectively, in order to be included into a grey list or a black list, you need to identify certain substantial malfunctions in this anti-money laundering system. We see there being no reasons for that to happen. If such a decision is politicized, then as a consequence, that might complicate the settlement system, because that would require more time to undergo compliance procedures, and the consequences definitely might be negative from this. As far as RMB is concerned, yes, indeed, in this market, there are short-term fluctuations of RMB exchange rate, which comes from, amongst other things, unevenness of the way the revenue is coming. In order to smoothen out such fluctuations, we introduced our own instrument, which is RMB swap, I think, 10 billion RMB, 10 billion yuan. And even during the peak demand days, half of it actually was taken. Last time, I think, we held this 30 days ago. Current situation is more or less stable. But episodes like that may occur.
That is also something that occurred in relationship to euros and dollar. We had this special instrument, euro-dollar swap, so that such short-term liquidity fluctuations could be cushioned. But with RMB, that may be more frequent and more material, which is because, irrespective of the fact that this RMB is a reserve currency, it has certain limitations to it. Our market players, banks and non-financial organizations must understand such peculiarities and manage their liquidity risks, because with the fact that in the currency structure, the RMB share has grown. Just a couple of comments, because one has to understand that an offshore RMB, the one that is circulating in the Russian market, this is an offshore RMB. This is not the kind of an RMB that is being used for the Chinese domestic economy needs. And to a certain extent, this is a different currency. And that is why the interest rate it has doesn't have to coincide with the interest rate you see in Shanghai in the money market, or even for a longer period of time. So deviations of the RMB's value in Russia as opposed to its value in China, that shall remain, and it shall depend upon the supply and demand balance for the RMB-denominated liquidity inside the country. From the point of view, truly, of insurance mechanisms like RMB ruble swap that Mrs. Nabiullina already mentioned, it performs its function exactly the way a similar ruble-dollar swap used to perform in 2022. But you should see the difference. It is important to see the difference between the liquidity management and the funding, because what possibly you are referring to is the fact that the banks are raising the RMB-denominated lending. They don't need the RMB liquidity for that. They need RMB funding for that. And in order to achieve an additional RMB funding, the only way to do that is to raise the RMB-denominated deposits. And the banks have been doing exactly that, and quite successfully over the past few months. Thank you. Dear colleagues, thank you so much, and have a good day. Have a good day.